If you think talking about mental illness is scary, imagine what happens when we don't talk about it. Join the conversation. Visit letstalkstigma.org.
Hello, I'm Frank Cammarata, Executive Director of the Erie County Office for People with Disabilities and board member of the Erie County Anti-Stigma Coalition. On behalf of the coalition, we welcome all the viewers and listeners today as we provide an opportunity to meet with experts in the field and discuss timely concerns. Today, we are focusing on the state of stigma, discussing mental health in Indigenous communities. As we recently celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day on October 13th, it is a good time to discuss how Indigenous communities discuss mental health and mental wellness. According to a recent report from KFF Health News on January 26, 2024, Native Americans often live with the weight of more adverse childhood experiences than other populations. Things such as emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, mental illness, and poverty. Those adverse experiences stack upon intergenerational trauma caused by racial discrimination, colonization, forced relocation, and governmental sanctioned abduction into boarding schools that persisted into the 1970s. Today, we will be discussing the mental health and well-being connection within the Indigenous community and potential resources for people to seek with our terrific group of panelists. Before I introduce our panelists, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Our program is 1 hour. During this time, if you have a question or comment, please type it into the comment box and we will respond accordingly. Your questions and input often lead to very informative dialogue, so please don't be shy. There's no such thing as a silly question, as we are all here to learn today. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Pete Hill is the All Our Relations Special Initiatives Coordinator at the Native American Community Services of Erie and Niagara counties. Welcome, Pete. Melissa Leonard is Chair of the Diversity, Equity, Accessibility, and Inclusion Committee of the Erie County Historical Commission, as well as a board member of the Indigenous Women's Initiative. Welcome, Melissa. And Samantha Nephew is the Communications Specialist at the Buffalo Center for Health Equity, and also board member in the Indigenous Women's Initiative. Welcome, Samantha. Thanks for being here today, all of you. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to jump right in. We're here today to discuss mental health and wellness in the Indigenous community, along with the stigma around mental health diagnoses. In our initial conversations, the culture and history of Indigenous people was something that came up over and over in terms of shaping mental health. Can you expand on that thought for us today? Samantha, can I start with you?
Sure. I'm going to start this whole conversation with just a little bit of my own personal experience with mental health and the way that it impacts individuals, and then, of course, families that revolve around that individual. That this is an incredibly important topic to me because of the way that culture, this country, how we treat Indigenous communities. My own father, he passed about 16 years ago, but he struggled a lot with eventually depression, anxiety, because of the fact that he didn't know that he was Native American until he was 18 years old. He was adopted by a white family on the east side of Buffalo, and he knew he was adopted before he knew he was Cayuga. And I have very distinct memories of being in high school and him walking me home from school, telling me about how much he struggled, knowing that he had been so disconnected from the community, and he struggled with it in his adult years. And I saw how that formulated. And when we talk about how we don't talk about mental health issues, depression, how all of these things interplay, as an adult, I can look back and say, wow, he really felt disconnected in just some behaviors and things that I would have seen growing up. It was extremely impactful. To this day, I take a lot of pride in being as open as I am about my heritage. I'm very proud to be Seneca and Seneca Deer Clan. I'm very, very proud of that. And it's because people like my dad were denied that. And I know that for a fact that he's not the only one in the different communities. He wasn't officially enrolled as a Cayuga until he was in his mid 40s. He passed when he was 55. Like that's how it shaped for him. So whenever I get a chance to be a part of these conversations, to talk about the importance, for me, the big importance is identity and culture and how we relate to that between ourselves, and for ourselves, I should say. Why I'm really glad that these conversations are happening, and a big thank you to Melissa for inviting me on for this conversation, just because, like I said, there are many, many pieces to the social determinants of health and how we become full and thriving people. But for me, identity, cultural knowledge is very big for me.
Thank you. And Melissa, how about you?
Well, thank you for having me, Frank, and I appreciative for that. And I think listening to your question, what I have come to really focus on is understanding where we have come from, how we've gotten here. And that's really important to understand the present and then heal and decide how do we move forward. And part of that historical context, is understanding the messaging, the language used, stereotypes of Indigenous people. And I think going back in history and even the start of this country, the history lends itself to Native people as being a problem. And that language has been used in policy that, New York State had a special committee on the Indian problem. And that lends itself to we don't belong, removal, boarding schools, all of that was public policy that has shaped how we ended up where we are in the present. And we need to understand that history and reckon with that language and stereotypes because that's how we move forward. So I think what I can contribute to that conversation is the research that I've done and just really educating about that history and how we got here, because it really affects us. And Samantha used a great word that I think is important, and disconnected is huge, a huge part of that. And we have to get more connected with one another, and that can help propel us forward.
And I'm going to, Pete, I'm going to get to you, but when you say disconnected, do you mean the Indigenous community, or do you mean overall our entire community here?
Well, I would say the entire community is disconnected. I'm sorry, Melissa, but I was going to say, no, definitely it goes between both the community at large. I'd say all communities have a problem with that. Just the state of how society is these days. We talk about it all the time. But also, I grew up in the city of Buffalo. I have family in both Allegheny and Cattaraugus, but even then, I mean, the issues we're talking about in terms of the strain of what mental health issues can do for a community. I don't know a lot of my family that live in both territories because that wall was specifically designed to create a boundary between myself and people that do have issues. When my mother moved here from Cattaraugus. So sorry to do the long-winded disconnected part, but I think that it goes definitely both ways.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Pete, how about you on the first question?
Okay, I would like to thank you, Frank, and everybody who's made this possible, and to thank both our co-speakers here tonight or this afternoon, and just really powerful examples. And I really appreciate you sharing Samantha, because part of what we know about these issues, not only for Native communities, but for so many communities, is how personal these issues are, and sometimes how difficult it is to talk about these things in an open setting. But I really appreciate everybody sharing what you've shared so far. One of the things about like culture and mental health that comes to my mind right away is when we think about health, a lot of times in mainstream society, for a long time we've been only focusing on physical health. You know, what do we put in our bodies? Do we get enough rest, exercise? What do we eat and drink and all that kind of stuff? Really important things. But there are teachings known as the medicine wheel. It isn't from Haudenosaunee culture. We have similar teachings in our cultures, but other Native cultures have this idea of medicine wheel that we should really not only think about our physical health, but our mental health, but as well as our emotional health and spiritual health. When we think about all four elements of who we are as human beings, and hopefully each and every day we grow, we learn, we continue to progress throughout our whole entire lifetime, that's what helps us be in balance. That's another major theme in culture, in many Native cultures. So when I think about mental health, I always think about our emotional, spiritual health, as well as mental and physical health. So that's one thing that really helps because, I think of mental health as what we think, and of course, emotional health is how we feel. And the issues that both have been talked about do have been impacted by a lot of the things, dynamics that Native people have been through. I heard talk about um, residential boarding schools and the Native people being a problem. And actually, it was Native American people are the only people in this country that it was the official policy to try and exterminate us. In the early history of this country, we were always seen as a problem. The loss of life we've had over the centuries has been tremendous. Lots of land we've had, and then lots of culture and things like that through those systems of boarding schools and the stereotypes and so many other things like that. So there are a lot of challenges to Native mental health, to being well, to being healthy in all four areas. Again, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual health. But the mental health isn't a key part because what we've been told in those residential boarding schools that lasted either 100 years, 140 years, or depending on which one they are, was that when they took Native children and put them in these schools, they were told that our traditional teachings are satanic and evil, and if you believe in that, you're going to go to hell and all these different things. So we have generations of people who not only were disconnected from their culture and their language, but that's forcibly done, intentionally done, to disconnect Native people from our own culture. So nowadays we have a lot of people who are struggling with knowing who we are, knowing, why don't I speak my own language? Why don't I know my ceremonies? Or why do people, if they go to ceremonies, how come sometimes feel, feel people don't feel comfortable because they've never been, or their ancestors or parents have been taught those teachings of that stem from residential boarding schools. So there are a lot of challenges there. But for me, part of what has helped me in my life is learning about my culture, is learning about all the things that we can be thankful for, looking at intergenerational issues, but not only as trauma, but also strengths, recognizing the endurance, the beauty, the strength that our ancestors had as they endured what they went through and give us our lives here. So yeah, culture is a big part of my journey as well. It helps me feel, and there's more to that story as well, but it just helps you realize how much there is to be proud of, how much I can connect to, and how much I have a place and have a meaning. I have significance. I have a sense of belonging in our culture. And that's one thing that a lot of people may not feel all the time.
So Pete, both you and Samantha mentioned, I guess separations and the boarding schools, and Samantha not, your father not knowing, where he belonged, and initially we talked about storytelling and the oral histories in the Indigenous communities. Why is this important, and how has that continued if we had these separations? So, Melissa, do you want to touch upon that?
So I think what I what I'm thinking about as you ask that in regards to storytelling is that brings us back to connecting with one another. So we connect through stories, no matter what the story is. And I think it connects generations, because you think of storytelling as, with an elder or a grandparent or your parents. And that that certainly brings us connected, back to connection just as a people. But I also think there's value in sharing culture orally, and also the idea that we are getting back to the traditional way of sharing things orally, which really in history often treats that as something archaic or ancient culture, that goes back to, because we just reference written history. But I think it's just so important that we reconnect with one another, and storytelling is one way to do so.
Melissa?
Or do you mean Samantha?
Oh, Samantha, I'm so sorry. Samantha?
It's all right. You'll have to forgive me. I had to take out my earphones because it was starting to get a little choppy here. So can you just briefly tell me again what you were saying?
We were talking about the importance of storytelling and oral histories. And I had mentioned, because the separations that had occurred within the Indigenous communities, it's got to be very important. But how does it continue with those separations?
Well, I like to say all the time that I ended up studying communications, because storytelling is absolutely part of what creates community. Storytelling is what makes change. Storytelling is what creates connection. And so being part of a group of people who have the same either beliefs or just core connections to what it means to be a human being, I think that that's incredibly important and something that I generally crave, and it's generally what I look for when I'm going to anything. Recently, the Seneca Fall Fest happened, and they talked about what the dancing that they were doing actually meant. I believe they were Navajo or Hopi. They were visiting, but hearing what dancing means to them and what the individual moves meant and how it relates to how they see the world and how they engage with each other, it's just incredibly powerful. And to go back to that disconnected word, storytelling, oral history, it's incredibly powerful. One, you get the human aspect, you get emotion that comes through that you don't necessarily get through reading. And I'm a voracious reader. I love to read, but there's something to be said about that community connection when you speak to each other, when you hear inflections, when you see facial movements and whatnot. So it's incredibly important, and I think something that's been lost. Yeah, I mean, when I think about it, like it goes back to do audiobooks count for your book read of the year? Yes, it does, because sometimes storytelling isn't about, critical reading and getting dates right or whatever, what have you. But it's about just getting that story and being consumed by it and being in that moment, being present for that story. And it's kind of insulting to believe that only reading written words is how you consume those stories.
Pete, how about you?
Yeah, some really good points. Yeah, the oral, a lot of native nations and tribes and communities, including Haudenosaunee, have a tradition of oral history, that we tell our stories and our history and our culture through our elders sitting down and talking to their families, their children, and everybody in the community. And there were studies that have shown over centuries that an oral history is more accurate from generation to generation than the printed word, because something gets printed, it's good, it can be read and everything like that, but then somebody prints another version of that same book or that same topic, and they can change that. And we see, like, it's as much as respect faith and religion and things like that, how many versions of the Bible have been coming out, and we see that more and more lately. But then that oral history, the strength of that is held by the community. There is, and when we think about who is an expert in our culture, a lot of our elders who are known as very, very knowledgeable won't call themselves an expert. They may say they know a lot, and I'm uncomfortable when you just introduce us, or me, I should say, of being called an expert, because even though I've been around for a long time, I've done a lot of this work, I wouldn't, it's the oral tradition is held by the community. And it's just, just that people get down together and they share about what have you heard? This is how I was taught. So there's more strength in that. At the same time, as much as we talk about boarding schools and all the rest of it, those are real factors, because when we think about what happened to these children in boarding schools, a lot of times they were treated like children should be seen and not heard. And anytime they spoke up, especially with their language or culture, they suffered a lot of abuses with that. I know a lot of children from many cultures who were raised as being seen and not heard. And to me, that makes no sense whatsoever. Kids are kids. They need to be running around. And, yes, we can teach them discipline and control and things like that. But at the same time, how damaging that could be. And then in the boarding schools too, if a child was abused or neglected, or there's been really horrible abuses that happened as they grow up and become a parent themselves or grandparent, they may not ever tell their children what happened to them at boarding schools. They don't want to relive those experiences. They don't want to traumatize their own children by what happened to their parents and things like that. And they've learned a lot of times to keep that inside and never tell what happened to them. And that's also part of the stigma around mental health and that storytelling, because part of our healing over all those things is to be able to tell our stories, is to be able to say, this is what happened to us, this is what happened to me, my mother, my father, my whoever we're talking about, because part of what the Creator gave all of us is our voice, and using our voice is that a big part of our own healing. So storytelling can be very helpful and very impactful. It connects us, and everything that both of them have said, I totally agree with. But just recognizing why that may not be, um, where people don't want to tell their stories, because how they were raised and how they were treated.
If anyone is just joining us, I'm Frank Cammarata from the Erie County Anti-Stigma Coalition, and I'm joined by Pete Hill from Native American Community Services of Erie and Niagara County, Melissa Leonard of the Erie County Historical Commission, and Samantha Nephew of the Buffalo Center for Health Equity. Today we are discussing the state of stigma and mental wellness within the Indigenous communities. Everyone joining us, please do take a minute and check out our website, letstalkstigma.org, and maybe join nearly 4,000 others in taking the pledge to end stigma. Also, if you are connected with a business, organization, or faith community, you can become an organizational member of the Anti-Stigma Coalition. You can find information for this on the website under the Members tab. And now back to our panelists. And as I go back to our panelists, we have our first Facebook question. And that question is there a stigma around talking about mental health struggles in Indigenous communities? Samantha, you have your hand up, so I'm gonna go there first. Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about that because, and for everybody listening, right, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm only talking about my own experience. And so what I can say from my experience is that sometimes we don't want to believe that there's anything wrong with us, right? So that's how I grew up, is that we don't want to believe that there's anything wrong or keeping us from our fullest potential. So something that I faced growing up is now I can identify it as a little bit of respectability politics. There can't be anything wrong with me. There can't be that level of depression or anxiety, both things that I face these days, and I'm working on it. But it was never really approached when I was younger, and I think that the stigma came from there can't be that boundary that keeps me from succeeding, right? I grew up lower middle class, poor, depends on what you looked at, in the city of Buffalo. And so when you have a family that comes from that background and they want to see you succeed, well, they don't want to discuss the things that might stuck, because if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist. But now I've seen that as an adult proliferate in a way that has been harmful, really hard to come back from. I've struggled with a lot of issues around that. So from my perspective, the stigma comes from we can't let this thing that she may or may not have keep her from succeeding.
Melissa?
Well, I think it goes back to the historical and cultural context of the boarding schools. And I think that those were systems, like Pete said, that silenced children. And it also created a gap in parenting, the parent-child relationship for generations. And I think now that I have 4 children and I'm older, I'm understanding how to talk about it, that I know that my dad didn't, not for any fault of his own, but from his father who went to a boarding school. And so I'm realizing that one of, part of healing is understanding, just what Pete said, using your voice in how to talk about what is going on. And honestly, the very basics of feelings. And I need my kids to understand what they're feeling and name that, and then the next step. So I think a lot of the stigma, it centers around fear of judgment, like Sam said, and I think there's a mistrust from the boarding school era of systems that are meant to be helpful resources. But I also think there's a open-ended question of how do we talk about it. And we need a skill set in that's missing from the generations affected by the boarding schools.
Interesting. And Pete, how about you?
I'm so thankful to be with both of them here today and to listen to them. I'm so proud of them to talk about everything that they've done and what they know and understand. So I'm really happy with that. One of the things that struck out to me about stigma is a lot of times, we're told, oh, we can tough it out, or, and that's why I like to talk about the medicine wheel, about thinking about our emotional and spiritual health as well, of course, as well as physical and mental. Because emotional, sometimes people don't feel good, or they don't feel good about themselves or what have they been through, and then throw on adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care and historical trauma. That's where some of the challenges come in. So I know a lot of people just say, hey, I tough it out. I'm okay. When we had in 2008 at NACS, we had our first ever community event just to talk about residential boarding schools. And at that time, it was a day long of tears and crying and everything like that. A very powerful day. And 2 things happened that day. There was a young, native gentleman around 50 years old, and he was in full tears when he said this. Because of what he learned about residential boarding schools, he said that I finally understand why my mother never said, son, I love you. Never heard that in his whole entire life, because his mother was sent to one of these residential boarding schools. And in the treatment in the boarding schools for a lot of those kids were really, really harsh, long time and everything like that. So when he said that, I know, I remember exactly who said that, and I know the family, and because of that father never got the love from the grandmother, one of his children died by suicide because that grandchild never got the love from the father, who never got that love from the mother, from the grandmother, because she was sent to the residential boarding schools. And at that same time, too, that same conversation, there was a gentleman, probably in his late 70s, mid 70s. He talked about what about all the good stuff in residential boarding schools. I had a roof over my head. I was fed every day, not the best food because we got mush every day, and I learned a trade. And then he goes on to say, well, yeah, I was sexually abused when I was 10 years old, but I got through it. I toughed it out, and I'm okay now. So even that denial of that trauma, adds to the stigma. Don't talk about it, tough it out, and pretend like you're okay. And even today's world, when we ask somebody, how are you doing? 99% of the time, the response is, I'm fine. And then we keep on going. But how many times do we really sit and listen to each other and actually care to take that moment, to take that time to say, how are you? Because I really want to know. I really care about you. I really want to make sure you're okay, and to do that. But so many times we're so, I'm fine, and keep going and everything like that. So there's a lot of things. And then the other thing about with not feeling good about with mental health, unfortunately, what some people do, and especially with this consequences of boarding schools, sometimes people turn to alcohol or other drugs as a coping mechanism. And that also interferes with their ability to have healthy relationships with themselves, with their families and community members. Because it's one thing that alcohol does do in the initial part, and other drugs, it helps people feel good. And when you get people who are really hurting from these traumas intergenerationally, that's where we can understand where there may be higher rates of addictions in some segments of the Native community. But I also want to celebrate and acknowledge that people are learning about these factors more. So as higher rates of addictions there may be, we also have among the highest rates of people in recovery in Native communities as well. So recognizing the bad stuff is there, but again, recognizing the strength, resilience that comes through our culture and reconnecting and all the things that we're talking about is something we can continue. I think we can continue to grow and progress and move towards that healing.
So the three of you have mentioned mothers and fathers. We actually got I think it's a really terrific question at this moment from Facebook again. Who are the most influential individuals that can encourage others to speak about mental health? Who would like to handle that one first? Melissa, can I ask you to take that? If you want to pass it along, you don't have to.
No, I think it's more of a personal question, versus a general answer to that, because I think it really could be anyone who cares. And I think it's really important to have elders be valued in our community. And then I guess, and then our youth, but then there's those generations in the middle that are important as well. And it's not just moms and dads and grandparents, it's aunts and uncles and friends. And we're a very communal community that, when we have a gathering, everyone doesn't sit with their own family. The kids are all running around and we're all looking out for the kids. And so I think in general, it's just anyone who cares and can see that, that a person needs someone or needs something. I think in that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's also somebody who's willing to be vulnerable and open. I've already shared very personal stuff about myself and my father, not because I'm necessarily looking for some kind of spotlight, but because if even one person can hear these words and be like, oh, wow, I'm not the only one, or, oh, wow, okay, she can say that, then I can do this. To me, even then, that's worth it. I don't know that I'm going to change thousands of people's minds with this, or help them understand, but even if it's one, that level of vulnerability on a public platform like this is worth it to me.
Samantha, thank you so much. Pete, how about you?
Yeah, those are great responses. Yeah. And I would agree, everyone can be that voice, because a lot of times we do conversations or meetings, stuff like that. People want to ask a question, but nobody does. And I'm so grateful that the questions are coming through the Facebook and everything like that. But if I ask a question, chances are, and I tell a lot of people, if you're thinking about something, go ahead and ask it, because 9 times out of 10, somebody else will have a similar kind of question. And Samantha, what you just said, for people speaking up, there's a role model that they can address these issues, then I can too. And it brings that safety. Because it also, when we think about parents and grandparents, sometimes when we think about who we connect to, it may not be our biological family, because some things that we've seen, if our parents went to boarding schools or whatever else they might have gone through, and maybe they don't know how to parent or how to connect with us as children, but we see other people have that ability. We can, sometimes parents have never learned how to become a good, healthy parent, and they do the best they can with what they've gone through. In the boarding schools, there's a lot of trauma there. The average child experiences all the stuff that we mentioned before. So it may be within our biological family, but it could maybe with our family of choice too. A lot of times people in recovery from addictions, their family is their recovery family, not necessarily their biological family. Even though they love their biological family, they can love their recovery family as well. So it can be inside our biological family and then the community. But I do believe that everybody has that voice, and by people sharing and speaking up, and just acknowledge it's okay to talk about these issues. It can be very helpful for everybody.
I would say that adds, to the stigma question that we've been talking about too. Sometimes all of these issues that we've been talking about that we face in Indigenous communities is sometimes it's all in one family. And then sometimes we feel bad if we're not talking to our brothers and our sisters or our mother and our father or uncle, what have you, because those issues, those are present in our very own families. So in the way society is set up, if we can't talk to our own family, then we can't go ahead and talk to anybody else in the community because that doesn't make sense. We're supposed to rely on our family. But again, like to Melissa's point, is that we're a very communal community. That try saying that 5 times fast. But we build our own families too, and so I think that that's really important. But I feel like a lot of times, again, like I said, if I can't talk to my own sister, the person that I grew up with, should I be able to talk to anybody else? But sometimes these issues, they, like I said, they're in our own families, and so I think that's a lot of the stigma as well as who should we be talking to, which is very different from who can we talk to.
We, as everybody knows, the 4 of us, we had initial conversations, and I know, Melissa, you had brought up this very important point, or this very interesting point. I thought you pointed out that identity is the primary mental health issue in the Indigenous community. Can you describe to me what that means?
I think that that is related to stigma. Sometimes discussions surrounding identity can be very difficult. And I think it goes back to a word that Pete used earlier, and it's belonging. And our history has complicated our identity and our belonging. And I think, the history of the boarding school era and land loss and all of that, it compounded into a message that I've internalized, which is fitting in. And I think that was really the premise of the boarding schools, partly. And so throw in there, we're disconnected from culture, disconnected from, where our families who might live on different territories or in different places. And what ends up happening is that becomes a lifelong struggle of who am I? And then compound that with stereotypes. This is how we want you to be. And then we don't fit that. And I just feel from my own personal experience in watching, my dad struggle with that, identity really can take a toll mentally. And that can be a lifelong struggle for many Native people.
Who here has ever been asked or told you don't look Native? I don't know what I'm supposed to look like to be, but I've gotten that. And so like to that question about identity, I do a lot of work I've done a lot of work in racial justice, BIPOC communities. I consistently in other communities, not like my own non-white communities. And I often feel the sense of invisibility because I understand we're not massive communities in the great sense of the country and where we're at. I get that. We're consistently, 1% or less of the population? And okay, so when we're looking at that and we're looking at, from my perspective, health inequities, it's very hard to include what we're having issues with. Now we have this platform and we're talking here, but in the greater sense, I'm trying to think back to it was a voting mechanism that they were talking about on CNN, and it was like 40% white, something percent African American, something percent Latino voters, and then it was other. And that was kind of splashed across Native Instagram and Twitter and all of that, like, oh, hey, we're just others. And so I feel like that is something that I've internalized, and I appreciate, Melissa, you being open about that, because I know it's something that I struggle with, is that I'm consistently in other spaces almost all the time where I'm other. Um, and that's something that I struggle with.
That's so interesting that you say that, Samantha, because Melissa and I had the same conversation about the invisibility piece, and I had a question about it, but I don't need to ask that question because you've kind of already hit upon it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I try to be very intentional about things that I do. I'm currently planning the third annual Native American Heritage Month flag raising. And it's something that both Pete and Melissa have participated in. And I definitely hope to see you guys there again this year, details to come. But I think what was most impactful for me the first year was how many people came up to me, Native kids. We got kids from the Native American Magnet School that come and see the flag raising. They see themselves in front of City Hall. These are kids that live in an urban setting. And like I said, very, very consistently were considered others. So to have that moment where they were at the forefront, the elected officials were there to address us, and there were some elders there as well. And everybody was telling me just how fantastic it was to be in the forefront, even if just for a day of that month.
Pete, how about you?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked about these issues. Um, One of the things that I wanted to bring up is the impact of stereotypes that we see in different media. I remember growing up and watching Bugs Bunny cartoons. This is years ago, decades ago, perhaps. And in a lot of those episodes, or some of the episodes, there's Bugs dresses up and he makes fun of this native person and all kinds of scenarios. A lot of times, the native people or people who are intended to represent native people are always speaking like me, big heap, ugh, and all those kind of, really uh, not good words or not very intelligent sounding words. And Bugs always wins in those situations. But then he's got other episodes of Elmer Fudd. Elmer is kind of slow, dim-witted, and always wins those situations too. Bugs always wins those as well. But the big difference is like nobody thinks of Elmer Fudd as representing all white people or representing European American people. Yet we think of that other character representing Native people. And even though I knew none of my family spoke like that, that thought got into my mind as well, because being a little kid, I'm not mature enough or not aware enough to look at those issues. And so sometimes those stereotypes that we see in old cowboy and western movies and even like science fiction movies, a lot of times they're based in a context. There's an Indian burial ground, and because of that, some spooky things can come out of that. So there's all these stereotypes that come from different media images, and how that impacts not only our own mental health as Native people, but how it impacts non-Native people's view of Native people based on those stereotypes. So that's also part of the challenges that people have, that Native people may have. But then we think of identity too. How many layers of identity are there? There's identity, me being Native, being Cayuga, my identity being Heron, my identity. um, there's tremendous diversity because, like for example, my father was one of 11 children in his family when he was growing up, and I asked him before he passed, "What were you trying to teach me as a young person growing up, how to be responsible?" And his main purpose was to teach me to take care of my family and put other people first. So one of 11 children, that was what he learned. My mother was his only child, so she wanted me to learn to take care of myself first, and make sure I'm okay. So, being a single only child compared to being one of several children is another layer of that identity. Living on territory and growing up on their nation territory compared to living off territory. I grew up in Southern California. After being 6 years old, my family moved out there, and I was raised as almost any other American person would have been in American society and education. So that's a whole difference too, where people grow up and then coming back home to New York. And when I moved back in '84, that was a huge culture shock for me, because our culture and the way people, way folks are on territory isn't the same as in Southern California. Living on territory or living in the city. Education level. Some people are very much educated, and some people, like my dad, dropped out of. He got to grade 3. So that is another difference. Having developmental disabilities is another layer of that identity. Being gay, lesbian, transgender, two-spirit, and having all the identities as well. And this is all within Native communities. So, there's so many layers of that identity, and that's where I really value the culture so much, because everything that I've heard about the culture is that we all belong. We all have a place. People are biracial and multiracial. There's questions there about where do people fit? Who am I? Am I this enough? Am I that enough? And I've heard some really, not good stories about how people who are biracial, how they're treated by other Native people who are full Native. So that's another layer of that identity. But again, that culture provides that we all have a place, all have a purpose, we all here for a reason, and we have that sense of belonging. It's there. We can go learn about it and find out about it more and share about it more too.
Mm-hmm.
So the identity is tremendous.
So Pete, I have to say to you, I think we're somewhat close in the same age. I think Bugs Bunny was decades ago, not just years ago. Yeah. So
as long as they don't have to say, long as they don't have to say centuries ago.
There you go.
I'd be lucky if I could.
Yeah. Can I add to that for a second?
Sure.
So, and I think those images are really important, and it's not just Looney Tunes, it's Disney and Peter Pan and Pocahontas and sports mascots. Yeah. And, what really I learned from my father was that those images came into the public, into pop culture, I should say, during the boarding school era. So while children, were in the schools being told you can't have your culture, the majority culture decided to pick and choose what they wanted from Native culture to use in cartoons and movies and films. And it essentially comes down to, a feeling of shame then. It related to that. And my dad used to say, people don't understand the hurt that those images can cause, and it really complicates identity when that becomes the prevailing image of Native people. And I think that just goes back to what I meant when I had said, that being really a root cause of a lot of mental health issues, because, research shows that a lot of that stems from shame. And so I think that's how those images relate to, that idea. But when Sam did the flag raising, that's a great example of how we sort of take that back, that pride and show of, just, I guess, negate the shame and be prideful again in culture. Those events and anything we can do to draw attention back to feeling pride in ourselves is really important.
Yes. And Melissa, I'm gonna point this out. It's a shameless plug for everyone knows my office. I'm the director of the Office for People with Disabilities. July 26th every year now for the past couple of years, we do a flag raising, and it's for people to have pride in the fact that they have a disability. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So good for you, Samantha. Good for everybody. It's terrific. I have another question. The time is flying by so quickly here. And I have so many questions that we haven't even gotten to, which is fine. But the question is, are there ways to strengthen, because we've talked about culture here so many times, are there ways to strengthen and improve mental health culture in the Indigenous community? Who wants to handle that one first? Samantha, you want to try that?
Well, I'm trying to think, I know that I've listened to Mike Martin, who is the executive director over at NACS, talk about a good mind. And it's something that even when I'm struggling with something, when I'm in a really dark place, I try to, and I don't know his speech verbatim, but I've heard him say it a couple of times. And that's something that I try to come back to. And it's just really integrating a lot of these lessons that we learn into the everyday. or when we are struggling. And another thing that I try to do is, and this is again for me personally, I try to think of all of our ancestors that survived to get me here. We followed this idea of the 7 generations. And while I'm working to do what I do in terms of policy and electoral elections and issues-based work, I also try to remember that at one point I was the 7th generation that someone was looking out for. And so it's keeping those kinds of things in mind. I don't participate in any kind of ceremonies. I wouldn't pretend that I do, but there are different parts of what I know that we've believed as Haudenosaunee people that I keep in mind that helps me shape how I can look at every day, because every day there's something going on that can, I read the news. There's something going on every day that makes you question your faith in humanity. But I try to remember from my standpoint, we didn't survive the boarding schools. We didn't survive. We talked about federal policies, one of them, which is literally name termination. We didn't survive those eras just for me to come here and not try. And that's something that I work with in terms of, at least for myself, mental health as an Indigenous woman.
Melissa, Pete?
Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, obviously this could be a really long conversation just about stigma, mental health, and
Sure.
everything. And how do we move forward is the biggest question, the $64 million question or whatever that we can think about. One of my major focus areas in my work has been addressing the question, how come Native people have these rich, beautiful cultures, what our Thanksgiving address, about 7 generations, and all these different things that are in our cultures, yet we're so unhealthy, that we have high rates of suicide, especially among our young people, all these different health issues. And most importantly, what can we do about it? So a lot of my work and a lot of programs that we've developed at NACS over the past 10 years, well, no, more 20 years, are really focused on how do we heal from historical traumas. And there's so many ways that we do that. Storytelling can be a big part of it. Having these kind of conversations can be a big part of it. As you probably know, I do a lot of trainings on cultural competency and trauma-informed care, but also historical trauma, recognizing the impact that is still being on in today's world among many Native communities and probably many other communities who have historical traumas in their histories, in their past as well. So we're really trying to focus on providing that healing, that opportunity. We had a Gathering of Good Minds that we had for 7 years. Now we have our Indigenous Health and Wellbeing Promotion Program. Is just trying to emulate that. And in 2006 and 7, we had our Healing Our People Through Empowerment program in Niagara Falls. So each one of those programs has evolved our understanding about how do we heal from historical traumas, how to regain our health, and not just survive what we've been through, but I think somebody mentioned in the beginning, how do we return to a sense of thriving? And that's what we're really focusing on. Obviously, there's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of people to be part of these conversations. The people who are in mainstream health services, including mental health, the more they know about these issues, about boarding schools and everything else, the better off it will be for them. Because that's one thing we kind of keep track at NACS, who's been through our trainings, because we want to refer Native community members who come to us to ask for help. If it's something that we don't provide, you want to refer to somebody who's been through some of our training so they know about some of the dynamics that their client may be dealing with and how to best handle those. So it's good, the village concept, raising children, very similar in many Native communities. But again, it's really focusing on how do we heal from the centuries of historical trauma. So every step that we can take, every time we say Yahweh or thank you, is actually helping us heal from our ancestors who were punished and beaten for saying that in boarding schools. So however we believe, whether we do ceremonies or not, and everything like that, we're on all on a path and a healing path, and how we make the world what we need to do. It's better. It's always good. But the connections, the storytelling, I'm so grateful to have these conversations with all of you.
Thanks. And Melissa,
I don't know what to add to that.
you don't have to. It's all right. We only have a few minutes left, so it's all good.
Mhm.
Somebody actually asked me to ask about traditional healing versus Western healing. Can Melissa, can you talk about that at all real fast?
Well, I think the piece of that, it goes back to what Pete had said about, Western healing, we often hone in on the physical. And I think traditional healing is exactly what Sam had talked about, the good mind, and it's holistic. It's viewing, you as a whole person. And I think oftentimes, it's related. I mean, even just with depression and anxiety, and mental health issues can manifest itself physically. And so it relates. And so I think traditional healing, without getting into specifics, really views the whole person. And it also lends itself to when you view someone as a whole person, then that identity comes into play. And so healing needs to be about not just, a physical healing, but also, a mental. And really, that's why I like the term that Nax and Pete uses in regards to wellness. I think wellness is a great word to describe what can really help in regards to traditional healing.
So you mentioned wellness. I'm going to ask just real fast because we're down to a couple of minutes here. Are there any local resources to assist people in healing? Pete, can I ask you that?
Sure. And I know Samantha and Missy have a lot of good information as well. If people, please feel free to reach out to me and to release my contact information at NACS, especially my email. That's the best way to get out to me or reach out to me. But there's a lot of organizations that are doing this work. There's a Seven Dancers Coalition. They're a statewide organization. They do really tremendous work on healing. A lot of support of women here at NACS. We have a lot of programs here that really help with that. We're doing a lot of events. All the nation territories are a lot of really good things that are happening in the community as well as, and the flag raising is a great way to think about that as well going forward. We recognize and thank the Buffalo Bandits, Sabres, and Bills for having a Native American heritage game or day or night. So the more visibility we can share, when I think Missy was talking about, or one of you were talking about the data, I've seen Native people being referred to as being statistically insignificant. And when I saw that, I thought, yikes, so the more we can bring that representation out for everybody, the better it is, the better chances we are to return to that sense of thriving instead of just surviving.
And Melissa and Samantha, you are both board members of the Indigenous Women's Initiative. Do you want to give that a quick plug? You want to talk about that at all in the couple seconds we have left?
Melissa invited me on, so I'm going to let her do it.
Well, that has really existed since the 1990s, and it has been several different women who have brought forward initiatives, and projects related to Indigenous women's initiatives. But we're in the early stages of forming the organization, but we do have an event every year on World Indigenous Peoples Day, which is August 9th at the Buffalo History Museum.
Great. Thank you very much. And so it happens here. As we wrap up, I'd like to offer each of you an opportunity to provide a few brief closing remarks on our topic. And when I say brief, I mean really brief. So let me start with Samantha.
Ooh, pass. No.
Pleasure.
I mean, I guess my brief closing remark is that, we're more than just the World Peoples Indigenous Day. We're more than just the argument between, Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day. And we're definitely more than the month of November. I very much care about, this paper behind me has health issues that face every month that we talk about, and Native people, face these things as much as a lot of other people. So I just continue to have us part of these conversations, ask us what we think, ask us how we feel, because like I said, I'm more than just a Seneca woman. There's a whole Samantha here that has a lot of thoughts and opinions about things. So please continue to ask us. Please continue to have us part of the conversation.
That was terrific. And Melissa, how about you?
So I think, it goes back to that statistically insignificant number there. And I think that these conversations need to be ongoing throughout the year, like Sam said, not just the month of November. But, I'm very appreciative to have been invited to the conversation. And I think, going back to that historical context, we have historically been left out of the conversation. And so I think that any opportunity to invite authentic conversation like this one is needed throughout the year.
And Pete, I'm going to give you the last word.
Awesome. Again, thank you for everybody being part of this. Missy and Sam, just really honored to be here with you. I like to encourage people to think of our connection to the natural world as well, because as human beings, our health in every way is totally connected to the health of the natural world. So the more we can think about that, it'll help us as well. But in my message for everybody, kind of 4 major concepts I like to promote: the idea of peace, pride, love, and respect to all and for all. All human beings, we can be treating each other as families, as sisters and brothers. So really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm again honored and humbled to be with all of you here today, those of you online, and Frank and everybody, Mike and everybody who's part of this. So many hours. Thank you.
I am honored and humbled by this group. Wow, that was fantastic. As a reminder to our audience, we need you to take the pledge to end stigma by going to our website, letstalkstigma.org. If your organization would like to join us in our cause, there's information on the website as well. Just click on the Members tab to find out how. Together we can reduce stigma and create an environment of support where help seeking and help giving are the norm. Once again, a huge thank you to our panelists, Pete Hill, Melissa Parker, Leonard, and Samantha Nephew. I'd like to thank everyone behind the scenes as well. Mike Telesco from Telesco Creative Group for his creative and technical support, and Karen Karaszewski from KKPR Buffalo for her production support as well. So on behalf of the Erie County Anti-Stigma Coalition, until next time, I'm Frank Cammarata. Join the conversation on mental health, and let's end the stigma around mental health diagnoses. Good luck on your wellness journey. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.